as we always do, but particularly thinking about the topic of today's discussion, it's more important than ever to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri country, unceded land, and recognise elders past, present and emerging, and members of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that this is their country that we're on. We're all migrants. Pertinent to today's topic because Viethen's going to be joining us with Scott Poynting, who's a professor at the School of Justice in Queensland University of Technology, and they've just had a book out, very timely and efficient work, I would think, the normalization of the global far-right pandemic disruption. So that you must have worked really hard to get that out in time, published last year, but digging into work that they've both been doing for a long time on how the far-right gets normalized in a global context and what that says about colonial continuity, anti-migration discourse, and gender toxicology. And if you're wondering what gender toxicology is, I won't say any more because Ulrike will explain it all to us. But it's really intriguing because we know that we're dealing with what is often presented as new movements that are old. And even National Socialism coming in the middle of last century, we're dealing with forces well before that, going back into the 19th, 18th centuries and long before. So it's excellent to have this contextualization from this research. So enough from me, Ulrike, we'll pass it to you. So we'll have half an hour of presentation, half an hour of discussion.
Okay. Thanks so much. Someone muted me. So
Oh, so you don't
need
to.
With the microphone.
Mute yourself.
Okay.
Mute your laptop.
You tell me. Okay.
Just otherwise we get
Thanks so much. First things first, because I'm speaking here in Melbourne, I also respectfully acknowledge the custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri, hopefully pronounced correctly, people, the ancestors, elders, past, present, and future. Thanks so much, Greg and Chiara as well, for organizing this lunch seminar. And it's wonderful to see so many interested faces and people here. And also, as Greg already mentioned, Scott is joining us from Sydney, and perhaps also some other people, not around the globe, because it's always a problem with the time, but perhaps from Australia as well. So what I will do, I'll just give, it's not working. Okay. Yeah. So just a short overview of the presentation, short introduction, where I will speak a bit about my background, what made me interested in looking at processes of normalization. Then to the point, what does normalization mean in the context of far-right populism? Then normalizing queer and minority sexualities, as you can see, question mark. And yeah, already announced the meaning of gender toxicology, though I'm only focusing here on toxic masculinity. So who wants to know a bit more on that has to read the chapter of the book, even better. But I will also speak about what is called anti-gender ideology. And last but not least, some concluding remarks, of course. So what made me interested in looking into processes of normalization, or we might say the dark side of normalization? When I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s in London, enthusiasm about new cosmopolitanism was in full swing. And my second PhD supervisor, Professor Mika Nava from Culture Studies, worked, for example, conceptually on the positive effects of the everyday normalization of mixed race love, relationships, and an outlook on cosmopolitan conviviality in Britain. I was skeptical of this very optimistic middle-class and individual vision of societal and cultural appeasement of visible and racial difference. And back then, when writing my PhD thesis about discourses on cosmopolitanism and plural in Britain and Germany, unfortunately, I found my reservations confirmed. In Britain and Germany, with their specific colonial, and as far as Germany is concerned, of course, also totalitarian histories, class, gendered, and racialized power hierarchies were continuing and linked to the historical discourses of othering very specifically, of course, in the different countries. In contemporary or new discourses of cosmopolitanism, that's why I call it situated back then, I came across increased tensions between notions of difference and alterity. And the rapid rise of Islamophobia also advocated by mainstream advocates of cosmopolitanism, unfortunately, after post-2001, was something I took very much interest in. So I analyzed discourses by Jürgen Habermas, Ulrich Beck, for example, as far as the German discourse is concerned, but also David Held and others in Britain. So if you want to have a look. My argument back then was that the 21st early vision, the 21st century vision of European cosmopolitanism could not do away with all these ambivalences or the dark side of cosmopolitanism. And I was warning to a certain degree of this, that I saw a backlash coming, so to speak. About 10 years later, roughly since 2010, 2012, and what then got traction, most people and academic colleagues were stunned by the fierce and persistent power of far-right populist movements, parties, and public debates that shifted to the far right across the globe and in continental Europe particularly, more specifically in Poland, in Hungary, but as we have seen more recently in Italy too. So since 2012, I would argue, new cosmopolitanism seems a far away fairy tale, really, of better and more open-minded societies. And that's the troubling knowledge we do have in comparison of the 1920s in Germany, Berlin, for example, taking this on board that only within 10, 15 years, this rather cosmopolitan, open-minded society turned to a really militaristic death culture, industrial mass murder, and you know this. So we have to take this lesson, let's say, of history where things sometimes change very rapidly, at least from the outside it looks at this, is not perhaps not at the core of what we are interested or should be interested in. And now I'm turning to the argument I will present in this talk, which is based on the book, and you see this here on the right, which I published with Professor Scott Poynting in 2022. Last year, September, it was out, who is participating, perhaps later on might answer some questions as well. So what does normalization then mean? Approaching everyday processes of normalization tries to grasp some of the societal, often gradual shifts on the surface, practices and discourses that encompass and arrive before the actual shockwave change in government, parties in parliament take place. What we argue is that capturing these discursive elements of processes of normalization is crucial to understand how a supposedly rupture to normal democracy can and could happen. European-based colleagues, and some of you might know them, Ruud Wodak, for example, Tixe Ackermann or Aurélien Mondon and Aaron Winter interrogate and have paid attention to the notion of mainstreaming in the context of extremist populist right too. Margit Feischmidt and Peter Herwig explicitly define neo-nationalism and neo-racism as main engines of the process of mainstreaming the extreme. Their approach is helpful as it names racism and nationalism as pushing extremism as mainstream, though our contention rather would be that it's overt racism linked to a modified version of institutional racism, that what they call neo-racism, as we rather would argue racism never did disappeared. So, nevertheless, the point of departure comes close to our own thinking, while arguing, and that's the point, that the clear-cut distinction between extreme political and mainstream liberal positions misses the point, as it's not looking at the entanglement of both, the transgression of institutionalized and temporarily less overt forms of racism. Another colleague, very important, I think, to mention him, Aristotle Kallis, while reading closely the work of Norbert Elias, rings a bell, explores historical fascism not as fall from and aberration of the normal civilizing process, but as encompassing the civilizing process. He regards fascist, and I quote, you can read it, fascist radical uncivility as rooted in a continuum of mainstream acceptability, embedded in key trends of the civilizing process, but resting on revised underlying norms about community identification and treatment of otherness. So why is the connotation of normality then and tackling processes so relevant? It's relevant when interrogating accepted, inverted commas, normal levels of institutional racism, normal standards of democratic consensus, pinpointing at the transgression of these normalities into systemic, violent, and rhetorical mainstreaming of minority exclusion. Because some could argue, okay, if racism is something that's happening anyway, so what would be the difference then? What does normalization then mean? But what we see in the last 5 to 10 years is a rapid, I think, the advancement of what minority exclusion means structurally, turning into more racist, other forms of racist, institutionalized racist form and criminalization. I will come back to this later. Recently, Scott alerted me to an interesting book by Jason Stanley. I don't know whether you know him, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, who analyzes closely common patterns of fascism across different times and places. And Stanley delineates 10 typical aspects, all mutually reinforcing each other, which I'm not discussing here. You might read Scott's review in the Australian Socialist, or even better, read Stanley's books. But what's relevant to our work on normalization here is that Stanley similarly detects a process of normalization of fascism when the, I quote, morally extraordinary is transformed into the ordinary. It makes us able to tolerate what was intolerable by making it seem as if it's the way things have to be or have always been. And the latter point, this aspect of forgetfulness, in my views, is also very central to what's happening in different societies now. And it might be interesting also to catch up on that in an Australian context. What does this mean of historical knowledge, also in terms of transgenerational perspectives on what's happening, experience of racism, fascism, and so forth. So, but going on, moving on, coming back to our book and the impact, and I'm sure you all are very interested in this one, particularly the role of gender in global far-right discourses. The renowned populism scholar Cas Mudde argues that familialism is a form of biopolitics, which views the traditional family as the foundation of the nation. Mudde argues that familialism reduces women to vessels of reproduction, implementing a gender-restrictive legal and normative framework in some countries, and he looked particularly at Hungary and Poland, with officially, I'd say, far-right governments in place. Following Mudde's contention, we might agree that most far-right parties and their ideologies advocate the heterosexual family model and increasingly a strict rule of gender binaries. That said, in Germany, and I don't know whether you are aware of that, the far-right party Alternative for Germany accepted a lesbian party leader, Alice Weidel. So what does this mean then for the normalization of alternative sexualities in this context of global or far-right context in different countries? And next, we will have a closer look how to analyze, how to read an image of a veiled Orthodox Muslim woman on the background of what I just said, what normalizing of minority sexualities might also entail, how it encompasses Islamophobia. To grasp some of the contemporary complexities of far-right trajectories and tackle the function of ambivalence with respect to sexualities discourses, I'm focusing here on the case of the Netherlands. I lived and worked in Amsterdam between 2009 and 2013, and watched myself, or witnessed myself, how a supposedly tolerant majority society projected their liberal feminist assumptions on newcomers, Muslim women, and since the 2000s, distanced itself from a very, I'd say, previous consent in liberal multiculturalism. And just briefly reminding you, there were two very spectacular murders in the Netherlands. The first one was the murder of Pim Fortuyn in 2002, who was gay and was also a politician. And in 2004, Theo van Gogh. So the first was actually murdered by an animal rights activist, whereas the second one was actually by an Orthodox or extremist, we would say Muslim murder. In the Netherlands, and epitomized in Geert Wilders' PVV, the Party for Freedom, the far-right party, the PVV gambled gay majority tolerance for discursive exclusion of homophobic Muslims. And I published on this previously with the AD Journal of Intercultural Studies, looking particularly at the Dutch case. What is of interest here is to understand how homonationalizing trajectories, I'm using here the term or concept suggested by Puar, impact the construction of racialized group boundaries with respect to the normalization and inclusion of queer identities tolerating the societal shift to the far right. In the image introduced on the slide, an Orthodox and veiled Muslim woman is gazing at us. The us, or we, are people randomly passing the train station area of Amsterdam, where the poster was publicly featured on a wall in 2010, where I took the picture. The Dutch text means I'm a lesbian, and by that throwing a light on intersectional complexities encompassing identity and gender discourses of national inclusion. While referring to visual social semiotics, and I just mentioned some names, Javid and Chris and Van Leuven, this image can be read in the context of counter-stereotyping and provocation to both a majority representation of white, non-Muslim or Christian lesbians, as well as projections of automatically heterosexual Muslim female identity. Here, the representational and the interactive as layers of communication between the image and the viewer are relevant. The visual statement creates, so to speak, attention to other perspectives, constructing a binary, usually between sexualized white female bodies in a bikini and hidden Orientalist bodies, burqa. And I will show another provocative image, and I hope you are okay with this. So here it goes. What you see here is a picture of what I would call a French crime scene, in inverted commas. In 2016, this image was published by the British newspaper Guardian. It caught global attention when showing an Orthodox Muslim woman on a French beach in Nice wearing a bikini. She was rounded by policemen asking her to undress the bikini. This was enforced following a bikini ban in 15 French towns and in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. The police ordered the woman, and I quote, to wear an outfit respecting good morals and secularism. What's troubling, of course, to all of us is that you see the white women dressed in bikinis, apparently either not being bothered and even worse, not stopping the police. So that's how a normalized everyday experience of racialism actually looks like, okay? So coming back to the poster, I go like this, okay? Coming back to the Amsterdam poster, the exposed eyes, mascara, makeup, signal to a certain degree stereotyped Orientalist perceptions of hidden and exotic femininity, though the claim conveyed in the text and the image interrogate both heteronormative generalizations of what I outlined earlier, who is heterosexual, and who might be gay or lesbian. In our book, we read this poster as a visual project on differential inclusion. For once, far-right trajectories going mainstream imply that the current post-liberal climate in some countries fuses sexual choices with conservative, rather, expectations how same and different sex partnerships might adjust to otherwise heteronormative standards, for example, gay marriage, and that the female Orthodox other here in this case could be included in this liberal vision of a progressive society. To back up this statement, I will briefly again bring in Puar. Her critique of gay complicity to the war on terror. Though set in an US-American context, Some of her insights can be applied to the European, the Dutch situated context too. She argues that some homosexual subjects are complicit with heterosexual nationalist formations rather than inherently nor automatically excluded from or opposed to them. She links this complicity to a West-built empire of global superiority. Clearly, the Dutch in the 21st century would not claim global leadership. However, the everyday repercussion with wide European feelings of cultural superiority towards Muslim others fits still this critical analysis. Gender exceptionalism works as a missionary discourse to rescue Muslim women from their oppressive female counterparts. That means that second, this symbolic inclusion of even Orthodox lesbian Muslims fits to what Sarah Ferris analyzes of gender differentiated ways of Western societies incorporating Muslim women in what she calls femonationalist projects. She approached the question what ways a gender equality discourse demanding women's rights is exploited within xenophobic campaigns. It means she interrogates the symbolic use of different actors as a case of convergence. As you might follow up, this again fits to our arguments that there is not this kind of strict boundary existing between an extremist discourse and a liberal one. So she's going beyond an assumed strict boundary between far-right politics on the one hand and moderates or liberal feminist positions here in this case. So though she systematically discusses again only 3 West European and member states of the European countries, namely the Netherlands, Italy, and France, some of the patterns she extracts or the analysis she does might be applicable to other countries too. And of course, I would like to hear your view on this here. The strongest contribution, in my view, is the problematizing of the economic capitalist logic encompassing different processes of gendered othering. She argues, as you can read here, I understand neoliberalism to be a political economic formation that institutionalizes the femonationalist ideology as part of the functioning of a state apparatus, in order to reorganize the productive and particularly the socially reproductive sphere. Following closely and analyzing national civic integration strategies, not only addressing Muslims, but generally migrants, Faris found that in all 3 countries, Muslim women and female migrants were incorporated into the concrete European femonationalist economies as domestic space keepers. Whereas Muslim men, migrants, predominantly Muslims, were or are constructed as outsiders threat, Muslim women are displaced into a social reproduction sphere of a different nation state. This is a powerful observation while giving some clues as to why some also middle-class women in Western countries, perhaps even in some Middle Eastern countries, and I'm just briefly referring to Barbara Ehrenreich's important book, Global Women, might represent this liberal notion of middle-class emancipation. It's unfolding with more complex contradictions, of course, but it gives some ideas in what ways women might be drawn into this Western superior narrative of women emancipation, unconvinced of their equal rights, in some cases entitlement, to sustain modern lifestyles that are characteristic to our contemporary world. As argued here, the reproduction of middle-class status and identification with mainstream discourses undermine any collective aspirations to go beyond that, identifying or solidarity with working class, non-white or non-Christian women. And now, finally coming to the colonial aspect, this has strong repercussions with what the colonial experience also might be about with respect of the social positioning of upper middle class women in the past. In what ways is there a colonial continuity to be seen? Some might recall that white European women, ladies, bought into the superior European civilization narrative and engaged actively in interventions to free the Indian, the African, and speaking here of Aboriginal families, women from their cultural and gendered oppression. This emancipation narrative seems to underlie some of the contemporary Islamophobic attitudes as well. And that's where the colonial continuity comes in. Decolonial queer scholar Maria Luganis argues very different arrangements for colonial males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers, I added, were made. Thus, it introduced many genders and gender itself as a colonial concept and mode of organization, of relations of production, property relations, of cosmologies and ways of knowing. Coming back to Ferris, that's part of what she claims as well, that the contemporary success of women's rights in xenophobic debates clings to the continuing influence of colonialism shaping nationalism rather than linking it only to gendered claim-making of far-right groups. And that is up for contestation, of course. I agree with Ferris, or we agree with Ferris, that the normative marginalization of minority ethnic and religious Muslim women and men are co-constructed alongside a shift to claim-making of liberal emancipation embedded in neoliberal capitalist market projects. What remains problematic is the discursive inclusion, as I outlined earlier, of sexual minorities into the 21st century national imaginaries of some countries, I'm not saying it's all, and the question to which degree the incorporation of sexual identity is now used as a boundary draw here. Definitely the case in the context of the Netherlands. The Amsterdam Muslim Woman Placard discussed earlier proves, as I said, the argument right that Orthodox Muslim women in principle can be incorporated into a national narrative of progressive and liberal queer sexualities. That said, prominent far-right governments, such as in Poland and Hungary, for example, engage vocally with anti-LGBT plus bashing, and by that blur majority normative orientations on the construction versus and sensualizing of sex gender identities to the far right. This is too early, by the way. Sorry. According to David Paternotte and Roman Kohar, the rise of the global far right and current forms of populism and anti-gender ideology, what they call anti-gender campaigns, have to be disentangled to grasp the complexity of their political impact in different countries. The term anti-gender ideology tries to capture an ideological strategy by the populist far right and the Christian ultra-right, targeting emancipatory policy, which was pushed earlier by grassroots feminist movements, supported by European Union as far as Europe is concerned, supported by EU anti-discrimination directives and jurisdiction of the European Union Court of Justice, as well as advocated by United Nations gender mainstreaming goals in the 1990s, or since the 1990s. Paternotte and Kohar remind us that the social fabric in countries, or European countries, is anchored in very specific national narratives of family and religion, and that majority acceptance of diversity of lifestyles is very fragile. What the patriarchal gender binary order shares in all countries, though, is a normative description how to perform femininity or masculinity. And the recent developments in Melbourne, for example, the staged far-right protest against drag queens reading children books and the following cancellation culture out of fear, tells a very timely story here. Linked to a rigid understanding of what sex gender means, so-called toxic masculinity became prominent in the media and public as performance of vicious masculinity by state leaders, by Putin, by Trump. Oliver Daddo and Isabel Hunter argue that the concept toxic masculinity was developed in the 1990s in psychological and sociological studies exploring the relationship between father and son. It received a wider attention in the context of gendered violence and misogyny, and further applied by research investigating the reproduction of hegemonic masculinity in popular culture. Putin and Trump represent this toxic masculinity, and similarly the far-right fascist group Proud Boys perform and symbolize this post-aggressive masculinity characterized by dominance, aggression, strength, sexual conquest, and the rejection of any traits or behaviors associated with femininity. But, yeah, unfortunately, these prominent examples of male toxicity are only the tip of the iceberg of an admiration of militaristic masculinities. A recent phenomenon in the pandemic hysterical climate back in Britain was the far-right group Alpha Male Assemble. This group took social media platforms and communication to a new propagandistic level when using Twitter and Telegram to attract new followers, initiated by ex-soldiers, former members of the armed forces. They instructed followers in military-style boot camps for the violent fight against state vaccine campaigns. It seems the pandemic and the rise of political economic insecurities enabled fascist toxic men to organize from this societal margin to attack the political and cultural center, and it's varying, of course, how far they came already. The so-called overtone window, some of you might know this, should be considered here as well. The blurred boundaries between mainstream anti-vaccination protests and neo-Nazi and fascist presence, Proud Boys in the US, but you might have heard of the Reichsbürger in Germany, demonstrations during the pandemic and afterwards meant that extremists took stock of the civil unrest and intended to shift what is called the overtone window. This concept of policy denotes the range of public policies that is acceptable to the mainstream in any conjuncture. Conscious extremists are able to mobilize situated resentments to recruit more people for the white, suprematist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, as well as neo-fascist views. And what's worrying, of course, is that extremists might exploit anger and social unrest, particularly of male citizens, who feel excluded from the gains of late capitalist societies. In Ireland, for example, the topic of housing crisis like here is on top of the agenda, and so recently demonstrations against asylum seekers and refugees. So extremists can use any form of social upheaval and crisis actually to exploit this and go further. So concluding remarks, more time. Agreeing with Farah's argument, we propose that unlike Muslim women who are targeted to be included in national economies, Muslim men, but it could be also refugees, migrants, black men in other places, are at the end of a racializing spectrum and often excluded from the gains and from the imagination of a liberal capitalist late modern society. The renaissance of some of the fascist gender and violence ideologies we witnessed, for example, in the mass murder by Breivik in Norway of 2011, or the murder of the Labour MP Joe Cox immediately, or very close, instantly 6 days before the Brexit vote took place, are examples of a systematic or systemic violence anchored in everyday forms of intersecting forms of racism and sexism or misogyny. As far as the transnational effects of extremist far-right violence are concerned, the New Zealand Christchurch massacre, and Scott can say more on that, reminds us that the offline and digital connections and the transnational mushrooming of racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynist ideologies have reached an unprecedented scale in the 21st century. So in our view, it's the intersections of misogyny and sexism intersecting with racism, but also taking into account what colonialism meant, institutionalized and carried on in the claim making of white supremacists. But beyond, and we could say, yeah, okay, they are jeopardizing our understanding of liberal democracy But again, we have to be very careful here, because beyond the surface of consensus of a liberal democracy are racialized and class social hierarchies that continue to exist. And as long as we are not willing to engage with this, the outbursts of so-called far-right extremism will come back again and again. So I will just finish this now with another quite nice quote from Max Horkheimer. It was 1939, sorry about that, no, 1939. Wer vom Kapitalismus nicht reden will, sollte auch vom Faschismus schweigen. Whoever doesn't want to talk about capitalism should keep silent on fascism. So in the end, it's also related to our capability, more radical interrogation of what late capitalism produces, and inequality, social inequality, which triggers unrest again and again. And as long as we are not seriously understanding this, it doesn't matter whether we talk critically on cosmopolitanism or now on populism. And I'm very keen to know what will be next on the agenda among academics. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. There's a lot of material covered there. Is Scott online?
Yes.
Can we bring Scott up on the screen?
Scott?
Yeah. He's there. I don't know whether, Scott, you wanted to add something before we go to discussion.
No, thanks, Greg. I think Ulrike said more than enough for people to interact with.
Well, we'll reach out to you with questions if that's
Yeah,
okay. And I think we've got enough questions for a whole afternoon. We did have a whole afternoon, but who would like to start off? Yes, I thought maybe I'll answer the question.
Yeah, that was great. I loved it, especially at the end, because I wasn't quite clear where you were getting at. So I have two very general questions. One, it wasn't clear to me what your hypothesis was about the connection between neoliberalism and the rise of the far right.
Yeah.
The last quotation gives it away, but I would like you to state specifically what your hypothesis is.
Yeah.
And the second is, let's look at it the other way around, is why does the far left, if it still exists, have such a hard time to get normalized? I mean, I wouldn't mind the far left to be normalized, frankly. So why is that not happening?
Mm-hmm. I love that question. Thank you very much. So I will respond first to the second question, okay? I think we can't really understand what's going on when we not recognize what the, let's say, disillusion with socialist views meant when the wall came down, the unification not only of Germany, but the transformation across European countries, particularly like after 1989, 1990. So the rupture perhaps to left-wing socialist visions that, because if you say there was or there's still a radical left, not being able to get a different form of traction and perhaps also continue writing on issues that might be related to an ex-communist vision of alternative societies. I can't say more on that. In some cases, and I know the case of Germany much better than other countries, that was left from radical left, from those who were part of the change in Eastern Germany. They didn't have any chance to say something after 1990 in the unified Germany. There was some suggestions, for example, a round table, which they would have liked to see. So because some of the advancement of East German society, particularly in terms of kindergarten and the situation of women in the workforce, were definitely more progressive than everything that existed in the West. So there was I'd say, a systematic silencing. And I'm not quite sure whether this was only due to the institutional silencing, taking power of people, or whether different people also, or intellectuals or left-wing people, became silent because another Fukuyama, was it? The end of history. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on in these years in terms of disillusion, I'd say. Disillusion and not finding an alternative or a new or stronger voice, which of course is a problem by now. The first question was about the connection liberal capitalism. Again, it's not by chance that we're sitting and talking or writing on this since 2008. Why didn't this happen, let's say, in 1998 or in 2000? It's happening after a very substantial global socioeconomic crisis, and it's now even worse after the pandemic. And again, there's nothing new on this. There's nothing new on this.
That's weird, because precisely after the great financial crisis, you could read in the New York Times, socialism is back in the agenda. It's shown exactly the problem of capitalism. Same thing with the pandemic. A day after, all the pandemic governance was like, well, neoliberalism is finished, because if we continue dealing on neoliberal sides, we're never going to get over this pandemic. So socialism is back in the agenda. But then it doesn't get normalized.
But you underestimate the amnesia. You really underestimate amnesia in terms of historical knowledge. And even if I would ask you now, what did you do during the pandemic? Do you really recall your suffering, the suffering of your family, perhaps, that you not were able, particularly in Australia, not go abroad? I mean, this is really varying to different people, I guess, that it seems the traumatizing that took place is silenced. I mean, there's no whatsoever form. I mean, of course, you can interview people and they will tell your stories, but in terms of the broader picture, politics didn't change, policy didn't change. Do socialist or radical left peak, feminists, whatever, take this really on board? I mean, we have young people who are strongly, let's say, Fridays for Future and reminding us that there is another planetary crisis, but I don't feel that's really translated into politics or in organizational forms of what you said, just radical left in politics or something. There's no satisfying answer to your questions. Sorry. Anyone else?
Vanessa.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. And I mean, maybe it's picking up on that question about the relationship between neoliberalism and the rise of right-wing populism, because, I mean, I was really interested in your argument because you seem to be arguing for the continuity of this phenomenon and its kind of entanglement with the liberal democratic project. And at the same time, there's a lot of arguments about this as a threat, the right wing as a threat to democracy. In fact, we've got a public policy seminar coming up, which is framed exactly like that. So I'm just interested in, I mean, you kind of seeing it as very much a kind of, I mean, you use the term coloniality, which is very much about the continuity of colonialism, which, yes, and I was just very interested in the way you've kind of conceptualized.
Yeah, thanks so much. I guess what I would respond to this is that we probably have to be more carefully when we use a concept like democracy. What kind of democracy are we talking about? I mean, I recently came across a lot of EU funding into a research, comparative research, exactly threat of the far right to liberal democracies. And I mean, I'm coming really from a different angle of discussion. That's why I longly or in length also explained where I come from in terms of my research interest in cosmopolitanism, because let's say the question of social inequality and that liberal democracy does not respond to that situation of a lot of people, and I'm not restricting this to single nation states, okay? That's like a global phenomenon, and we know this, North-South and so forth. The issue of redistribution of wealth is not on the agenda. Even worse, and I didn't say that, I mean, we have far-right populist parties in some countries, but the country where I live now, I'm living in Northern Ireland, but part of the UK, you don't need far-right parties in government for far-right racist politics. That's the problem. That's the problem we are talking about. I mean, liberal democracy, I understand the concept of, let's say, liberal society in terms of individual liberal attitudes, tolerance, and habit. But as an organizational form for society at large, I'm not into liberal democracy. I think that there should be a vision of social democratic, or even like somewhere has to be the social. But liberal democracy, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. And we know that. I mean, that's why das code. We know that. Sorry. I mean, there's nothing new about this. There's nothing new about this. Oh, sorry. So of course I never made a lot of friends with my analysis. Otherwise I would be a professor. So I'm happy where I am. Okay, some more question. No?
I'm sure there are
Scott,
questions.
yeah, dare to ask.
Yes.
Dare to ask.
Or comments. I mean, you may have some comments.
Yeah, exactly.
Just from a different perspective,
Yes.
because I mean, my previous life actually had research on the far right and the utilisation, particularly around feminist arguments. And I suppose I make an observation, which I think is sort of is going to Overton's window and sort of what culturally constructed debates exist within any society. The evidence that was found, and this is not published unfortunately because it went to cabinet in confidence, but I'll speak to it anyway, because this is obviously Chatham House, I hope. They were essentially utilised by the far right in an opportunistic sense. So there was no essential commitment to any of the underlying principles. So, you know, people who would put tropes up online attacking minorities on the basis of a version of a feminist critique would also be posting misogyny. Yeah, so it's sort of like, the way I'd sort of characterise, I'm interested in your response, is I always thought it was best to understand this issue as tactical. You know, it exists within a tactical framework of recruitment and gaining support. And so in some circumstances, it would be to support certain minorities, particularly minorities who would be perceived as being potential victims of whatever migrant group was coming in, and their social attitudes, particularly around sexuality. And then and other times it would be sort of more mainstream feminist arguments, but they were essentially deployed purely tactically.
You said that's the goal, or that's how the populism operates.
Yes, so it's sort of an instrumentalist view that they would appropriate arguments for tactical purposes.
They being the sort of far right.
Yeah, the far right, and the very same people who are leaders, would have posted something completely contradictory in another setting.
Depending on the audience.
Depending on the audience, yeah.
Please,
yes, correct. So it's sort of like these were sort of tactical, and so the variation in that context is perfectly understandable because there's actually no fundamental commitment to the underlying principles.
You're close to Cosmodus' argument, or the people who regard this as like what they call a sin form of something, so it has always to adapt to be more efficient and to go that way.
The othering is a central part of it. Yeah. So you have to other someone, and it's essentially, and this was just research on people's social media posts. So you look at the people who are posting, and you look at the concept of the contradictions between what they're doing and doing public social media scrapes. And so it was very much, there was no coherence to the ideological position, but there was a coherence to the attempt to other.
Yeah.
So the underlying principle of what they're doing was actually consistent, but the arguments that were deployed or the persuasive processes were in fact quite contradictory.
But there was a white supremacist thread running through all of this.
Yeah, or at times that would not be deployed. At times it would be a feminist. You know, it was just about othering certain communities.
Yeah.
So sort of what your experience or point of view?
No, I mean, yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, that's so crucial. Why the problematizing of liberal feminism. I mean, feminism by now might be an empty container or empty signifier, as some people say, because it became problematic because it's not kind of carrying a certain kind of value orientation in itself. But the contemporary form, what you were just saying, that's adaptable. I guess that's what researchers already also described. And I remember the special issue we did here with the Journal for Intercultural Studies. I think that was a paper from a colleague from Düsseldorf, from Germany, who also analyzed the language that they, for example, used language and tools that you previously would in the 80s would have had as a signifier of anarchist autonome language. So there's this kind of hybrid forms, I rather would call this hybrid forms, how they adapt to a 21st century contemporary society where different tropes, different discourses are already mainstreamed. I mean, there's, where's the challenge then? What's left in it, so to speak?
Yes, so the way I describe
apart from
is that
the old pattern of othering.
That sort of vampire inter-discourses within an Overton's window that exist.
It's a nice expression.
You sort of exploit them for othering others.
Yeah.
Fetty.
Oh, okay. Now, I have no question to be honest with you. I'm just been reflecting on what you said, Ulrike. Some of what you said is extremely difficult to reconcile. It's not no fault of your own, obviously, in terms of analytical framework you're presenting. But I'm still deeply unsettled by some of the arguments in this presentation, and some similar research I've been able to scan previously. And one of them is, what does it tell us about the emerging polity within which we are all meant to be operating? If liberal democracy is becoming clearly a challenging project, and maybe even a failing project, if this deep sense of othering of particular groups is feeding a lot of this normalization of this kind of politics, which is really very, very, from an ethical or whatever point of view, is extremely difficult to come to grips with. And I see that you've worked on Marian Iris Young and Sarah Ben Habib before her, and many of them have been wanting to charter a new pathway within which we can envisage a way of challenging this, whatever you call it, failing late modernity, or whatever you want to call it, Where are we going in terms of really ensuring that we are dealing properly with this new politics of difference? Clearly, it's failing in Europe. It's problematic in Australia and elsewhere. And we are not owning up to the big elephant in the room, which is really a failure or a lack of a capacity to accept difference on the terms of those who are being described as. I think along Miguel, I'm just wanting to see where it's taking us.
This is great. This is like a political theory seminar.
Yeah, it is.
I feel so at home.
You know what I mean?
I always refuse this label because I'm also feeling more on the theoretical side as a political socialist.
So thank you, Dave. I was only thinking.
No. I mean, quite right. But what I'm problematizing, or let's say pinpointing again and again, that's what I was saying earlier. There is also this lack of acknowledgement of public intellectuals, and that's not happening since today, but for ages, to take on this challenge of what social inequality or the matter of redistribution of wealth should and could mean in different countries and different societies. And unless we as intellectual academics don't engage with this more thoroughly, and of course not only one country we're talking, of course. I think we are, again, that's why I was a bit cynical in the end, we are confronted again with failure of liberal democracy, because liberal democracy on that level is not good enough. It's not good enough. And just to silence or to illustrate this differently, some of the phenomenon of the more recent populist outrage it's not the usual suspects of what you would think of working class or subproletariat. It's middle class people who go on the streets and demonstration. That was the same during the pandemic in Germany, because they have a strong sense of entitlement, how their life should look like. But here we start. What does it mean? What does it tell us? if certain groups have more power, perhaps, and are more visible, have the possibility to articulate their right to entitlement, whereas other people are silent or systematically marginalized. They're not even on the picture or in the frame. So it is, and that's, I will end with this, and Scott might say something.
Scott, you may have some comments about Australian politics.
On the notion of liberal democracies. Yeah, there has to be a vision. I completely agree with you. There has to be a vision of social, more just utopia, and probably also crossing the line to what contemporary world would mean post-capitalism, post-extractivism, or what they call it. I think there has to be a vision somewhere. Otherwise, we are collapsing again.
We'll turn to Scott for a vision.
Yeah.
And see if he can wrap it up for us.
Scott, your turn.
I haven't heard all of the interaction very clearly, but if I could just come in on the point about the logical contradictions in some of the far right interventions on online, and some of the positions that are being adopted for basically recruitment and propaganda purposes. It's really hard to underestimate the level of cynicism, I think. I mean, if we cast our eye back to the height of the pandemic and the lockdowns, it was just stunning to see groups of neo-Nazis parading and marching literally under the banner of freedom, for goodness sake. Since when have neo-Nazis had a commitment to liberal democracy? The Nazis themselves used to sneer about liberalism and saw it quite instrumentally as an entree for them, while all the time disparaging it as a set of principles. I've got my, when you see the sorts of things that Ulrike's adduced about the AFD's, adoption of homosexuals' rights or women's rights as a slogan with which to beat immigrants, and particularly Muslim immigrants, I don't think there's anything terribly surprising or new about it, and I don't think we can expect coherence or consistency from our enemies, and we have to see them as our enemies.
Thanks, Scott. We're out of time here, but we are going to pick up this discussion next Wednesday evening, so 6 o'clock at Deakin Downtown. Lydia Khalil's book, The Rise of the Extreme Right. Yep, and it'd be great to have you there in discussion. So, and we'll also have Deb Smith from the EU, who's done a lot of work on the far right. So really timely we've had today's presentation, and we've got much more to discuss in this space. It's all a bit grim and dispiriting, but one takeaway is that the old lesson of learning to be respectful to each other and to be kind is part of the vision that we seek and part of the solution, because the language of hate and incitement of hate leads us into hell, basically.
That's for sure.
On that cheery note, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.